The floorboard gave way beneath me. My fingers closed around a locked leather ledger, Chloe's name embossed in gold. Then the door crashed open, and a man I'd never seen lunged at me, screaming about burglars. I swung the book hard. Now I'm barricaded in a pantry, my breath ragged, reading the first page. The deconstruction of Sarah Johnson. The car wreck wasn't an accident. Chloe set this up, and I'm the only one who doesn't know why. The ledger's pages whisper secrets I wasn't meant to find. Outside, the guards' groans turn to curses. My phone's dead. The pantry door shakes. One thing's clear. Chloe didn't just crash her car, she crashed my life. And I'm still holding the wreckage. Mildew clung to the back of Sarah's throat. A thick, sour weight that tasted of wet drywall and forgotten laundry. She stepped over a splintered floor lamp, her work boots crunching against broken porcelain. Chloe's townhouse, once a sanctuary of beige minimalism, now resembled a ribcage picked clean by scavengers. Rainwater drummed against the plywood boards covering the windows, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the soles of Sarah's feet. The humid North Raleigh air pressed into the room, heavy with the scent of ozone and the cloying, artificial vanilla of a candle that had burned down to a blackened wick on the marble countertop. Sarah's fingers trembled as she straightened the hem of her utility jacket. A reflex, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had dissolved into chaos since Chloe's car spun across the interstate 3 days ago. Sarah needed that insurance card. Chloe had been insistent from her hospital bed, her voice a fragile rasp. The blue folder, Sarah. Please, I can't breathe knowing everything is a mess. Sarah reached the kitchen island, where the marble surface sat buried under a layer of silt and shattered glass. Her fingers brushed aside a sodden pile of mail, uncovering the corner of a leather-bound book. The texture was pebbled, cold, and slick with grease. She gripped the spine, pulling it from the muck with a wet suction sound. Her boot caught on the edge of a floorboard that didn't sit flush with the rest of the hardwood. It gave way with a sharp crack, revealing a hollow space beneath the joists. She knelt, the dampness of the floor soaking into her jeans. Reaching into the dark gap, her fingers brushed something cold and heavy. She pulled it out. A second ledger, bound in obsidian-colored leather, far heavier than the first. It felt like a lead weight in her palms. She didn't have time to wonder why a minimalist like Chloe kept secrets under the floor. She just knew the weight of it felt like a debt she hadn't yet recorded in her own logs. She whispered, 2,847. As she mentally added the intrusion to her list of apologies she would eventually owe for prying. The silence of the house was shattered by the front door, hitting the wall with a percussion that shook the remaining glass in the window frames. A man charged into the foyer, his silhouette framed by the gray afternoon light. He wore a tactical vest with "Security" printed in faded white letters across the chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call out. He saw Sarah kneeling over the hole in the floor and lunged. "Hey, get away from that!" His voice was a jagged saw, cutting through the humid air. Sarah scrambled backward, her heels skidding on the slick floor. "I live here. I'm supposed to be here. I'm Chloe's friend." The man didn't listen. He was a wall of muscle and professional aggression, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards with a terrifying rhythm. He reached for her shoulder, his hand a vice of calloused skin and cold intent. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs as he pinned her against the kitchen island. The smell of his stale coffee and old sweat filled her senses, a sharp contrast to the vanilla scent of the house. He was trying to zip-tie her wrists, the plastic clicking like a predatory insect. Terror, sharp and electric, surged through Sarah's limbs. She wasn't a fighter. She was a woman who kept spreadsheets of her mistakes. but as the metal edge of the island bit into her spine, she felt the heavy obsidian ledger still gripped in her right hand. She didn't think. She swung. The corner of the book caught the guard squarely in the jaw with a sickening thud. The man's head snapped back, his eyes rolling for a fraction of a second. The grip on her arm loosened. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She shoved past him, her heart thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled into the kitchen, her socks sliding on the spilled flour and grit. The pantry was a small, windowless closet tucked behind the refrigerator. She dove inside, pulling the heavy oak doors shut and sliding the manual deadbolt just as the guard's weight slammed into the other side. The wood groaned, but held. Sarah collapsed against a shelf of canned organic tomatoes, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. The guard began to pound on the door, the vibration rattling the jars against her back. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin. "Open the door, lady. You're making this way worse for yourself." Sarah ignored him, her eyes fixing on the ledger in her lap. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the cover. She needed to focus. She needed to count. She needed to find a reason why this was her fault. She flipped the cover open. Subverted. The first page was not a list of debts or business contacts. In elegant, precise calligraphy that Sarah recognized as Chloe's own hand, the heading read, "The Deconstruction of Sarah Johnson." Sarah's breath hitched. Her eyes darted down the page, scanning the dates. They went back years. Every mistake Sarah had ever made, every late delivery, every panicked apology, every time she had doubted herself, was recorded here in Chloe's handwriting. But it wasn't just a diary. It was a blueprint. Phase 1. Financial isolation, she read. Phase 2. Psychological erosion. Then she saw today's date. The ink looked fresh, barely dry in the humid air of the pantry. June 14th. The grand exit. Stage a vehicular malfunction at the 440 interchange. Use the trauma to verify subject's loyalty. If she enters the house alone, she passes the first threshold of the protector archetype. Sarah felt the world tilt. The car accident, the shattered glass, the hospital bed where Chloe had gripped her hand and cried about being alone in the world. It had all been theater. Chloe hadn't been a victim of a reckless driver. She had been the director of a play where Sarah was the only person who didn't know her lines. Sarah's mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe Chloe was writing a book? Maybe this was a therapy exercise. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it, because if Chloe wasn't her best friend, then Sarah was truly alone. She remembered how Chloe had smiled when Sarah arrived at the hospital. A warm, weary smile that had made Sarah feel like the most important person in the room. "You're my rock, Sarah," Chloe had whispered. The warmth of that memory began to curdle. Sarah looked at the next line in the ledger. If subject retrieves the ledger, deploy the intruder to test her physical response to threat. Measure her willingness to use violence to protect my assets. The pounding on the pantry door stopped abruptly. Silence filled the small space, heavier and more terrifying than the noise. Sarah realized the guard wasn't trying to get in anymore. He was waiting. He was part of the script. Her loyalty hadn't been a gift she gave to a friend. It was a resource Chloe was mining. The accident was a trap, and Sarah had walked right into the center of it, clutching her concern like a leash. She felt a cold, hollow ache in her chest. Everything she had done for the last 5 years, the 80-hour weeks, the missed rent to cover Chloe's emergencies, the constant apologies. It was all being monitored like a lab experiment. She wasn't a friend. She was a project. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the cold leather of the book. She had spent 2,847 entries worth of her life trying to be perfect for a woman who was actively trying to break her. The ledger wasn't a secret she had found. It was a mirror Chloe had left for her to find, just to see how she'd react to the reflection. A soft click sounded from the other side of the door. The guard wasn't pounding anymore because he was unlocking the pantry from the outside with a master key. Sarah jumped to her feet, her eyes darting around the cramped space. There was a small rectangular window near the ceiling, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was meant for ventilation, but it was her only exit. She piled 2 crates of canned goods on top of each other, her movements frantic and clumsy. The lock on the pantry door turned. Sarah scrambled up the crates, the metal edges cutting into her palms. She shoved the window open. The hinges screamed with rust. She didn't look back. She didn't check to see if the guard was watching. She hauled herself up, the rough siding of the house scraping her stomach, and tumbled out into the wet mulch of the flower bed. Rain lashed against her face, cold and biting. She scrambled to her feet and ran toward her car, parked at the curb. Her fingers fumbled for her keys in her pocket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, diving into the seat. "Start, start, start," she hissed, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine groaned. A hollow, metallic clicking sound echoed from under the hood, but the motor wouldn't catch. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, her eyes darting to the front door of the townhouse. The security guard emerged, his face a mask of cold fury. Sarah popped the hood and lunged out of the car. She didn't know much about mechanics, but she knew what a spark plug looked like. When she looked down into the engine bay, her breath hitched. The thick, rubber-coated wires that should have connected the engine blocks were gone, neatly severed, the copper cores glinting in the rain like tiny, severed nerves. She reached for her phone on the dashboard to call 911, but the cradle was empty. She remembered setting it there when she arrived. It wasn't there now. Someone had been in her car while she was in the house. She was stranded. The suburban streets of North Raleigh stretched out in every direction. A labyrinth of identical gray houses and manicured lawns that suddenly felt like the walls of a maze. She gripped the obsidian ledger to her chest, the leather soaking up the rain, and began to run. She avoided the main road, ducking instead into the thick belt of woods that separated the cul-de-sacs. The ground was a slurry of mud and rotting leaves that sucked at her boots. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, snagging her jacket and scratching her cheeks. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and the low, constant hum of air conditioning units from the nearby houses. A sound that usually signaled comfort, but now felt like a collective, mechanical growl. As she crouched behind a massive, moss-covered oak to catch her breath, Sarah opened the ledger again. Her fingers were numb, her breath coming in white plumes in the cooling air. She flipped toward the back, searching for anything that would explain why her life was being dismantled. A small envelope fluttered out from between the pages. Inside was a silver key, her own spare house key, the one she kept hidden in a fake plastic rock near her porch. Beside it was a photograph. It was Mark, her ex-fiancé, sitting at a sidewalk cafe. The timestamp at the bottom was from 3 weeks ago. They had broken up 2 years ago, or at least she thought they had. The photos showed him talking to a woman whose face was obscured by a silk scarf. Chloe, Sarah's stomach did a slow, sickening roll. She hadn't just lost her friend. She was losing the history of her own life, A low rumble vibrated through the ground. It wasn't thunder. It was the rhythmic, heavy purr of a high-performance engine. Sarah peered through the underbrush. A black SUV, its windows tinted to a fathomless obsidian, was crawling slowly down the service road that bordered the woods. She recognized the vehicle. It was Michael's, Chloe's brother, a man who measured his coffee temperature to the degree and viewed the world as a series of variables to be mastered. The SUV stopped. The driver's side window rolled down just an inch. Sarah heard it before she saw him. The rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a silver ring hitting the steering wheel. Michael was counting. He was waiting for her to move. Sarah pressed her back against the tree, trying to become part of the bark. Her heart was a drum, loud enough to give her away. She could smell the wet earth and the faint metallic scent of the SUV's exhaust. Suddenly, the engine roared. The SUV didn't stay on the road. It lunged over the curb, the heavy tires churning through the mulch and saplings. Michael wasn't looking for her. He was hunting her. The vehicle crashed through the undergrowth, the headlights cutting through the gray gloom like the eyes of a predator. Sarah bolted. She ran deeper into the woods, her lungs burning, her vision blurring with tears and rain. She could hear the SUV behind her, the sound of snapping branches and grinding metal getting closer. Michael was using the vehicle as a battering ram, clearing a path through the forest with terrifying precision. She saw a steep embankment ahead, a concrete-lined drainage ditch that ran beneath the main road. It was a gray pit, slick with algae and rushing rainwater. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself over the edge, sliding down the rough concrete. The impact jarred her teeth. She landed in 6 inches of freezing, rushing water at the bottom of the ditch. The roar of the water was deafening, a constant, violent sound that drowned out everything else. She scrambled under the lip of the concrete culvert, pulling her legs in and clutching the ledger to her chest to keep it dry. Above her, the SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the ditch. The headlights cast long, distorted shadows against the opposite wall. Sarah held her breath, her ribs aching from the fall. She could hear the rain drumming on the roof of the car and the faint, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Michael's ring. He stayed there for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. The water swirled around Sarah's waist, numbing her skin, smelling of motor oil and old leaves. She watched a single high-heeled shoe, red, elegant, and completely out of place, tumble past her in the current, snagging for a moment on a metal grate before being swept away into the dark. Finally, the SUV backed away, the tires spitting gravel. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, replaced by the relentless moan of the wind. Sarah sat in the dark, shivering. She pulled a small, waterproof flashlight from her jacket, part of her emergency preparedness kit she always kept because she was terrified of being caught off guard. She clicked it on, the beam weak and flickering. She opened the ledger to the financial section. She expected to see Chloe's business expenses, but what she found was a meticulous record of her own ruin. Row after row of figures detailed transfers. Her business taxes, the money she thought she had been paying to the IRS for her freelance design firm, had been diverted. Every quarter for 3 years, the funds had been moved into a private offshore account. The account was in Sarah's name, but the recovery email and phone number belonged to Chloe. Sarah felt a wave of cold horror that had nothing to do with the water in the ditch. Chloe hadn't just been stealing. She had been building a cage. The bankruptcy Sarah had suffered 6 months ago wasn't bad luck. It was a planned demolition. Chloe had triggered the audit. Chloe had filed the anonymous tips about irregularities. And there, on the final page of the section, was a printout of a wire transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning. It was the final balance of Sarah's stolen life, $400,000, being moved to a legal defense fund for Chloe Miller. Sarah realized with a jolt of pure, crystalline terror that she wasn't just a project. She was the fall guy. Chloe was planning to disappear, and she was leaving Sarah behind to answer for the crimes Chloe had committed in her name. 2,848. Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. This was the biggest debt of all. She had apologized for existing while Chloe was busy erasing her. She forced herself to stand, her legs cramping in the cold. She had to get to the library. It was the only place with public computers, the only place she could upload this evidence before Chloe's legal defense became a reality. She climbed out of the ditch, her fingers clawing at the wet grass. The library was 3 miles away, past the North Raleigh shopping district. She began to walk, keeping to the shadows of the hedges, a ghost in her own neighborhood. The public library was a sterile, white-walled fortress of glass and fluorescent light. To Sarah, it usually felt like a sanctuary. But tonight, the grid of lights on the ceiling looked like a cage. She slipped through the sliding doors, the blast of air conditioning making her shiver violently. She headed straight for the guest computers in the back corner. The library was nearly empty. The only sound the rhythmic zip-zip of a flickering light and the low, haunting hum of a woman in a heavy cardigan. Amanda, the librarian, who was shelving books with a distant, vacant expression. Sarah jammed the ledger onto the flatbed of the heavy desktop scanner. She worked with frantic, jerky motions, her eyes darting to the door every time it hissed open. "Come on, come on," she hissed at the progress bar on the screen. "You look stressed, Sarah. Stress is just a story we tell our nervous systems." Sarah froze. The voice was smooth, bright, and unnervingly calm. She turned to see Rick, Chloe's wellness coach, standing at the end of the row of computers. He was wearing a tight, moisture-wicking shirt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. In his hand, he was fumbling with a small, crinkling sugar packet. "Rick," Sarah breathed, her hand hovering over the scan button. "How did you find me?" "We're all connected, Sarah. Energy finds energy." He stepped closer, the crinkle of the sugar packet filling the silence. "Chloe is very worried about you. She thinks you're having let's call it a perceptual break. Why don't you give me that book? We can go get some tea. I have a special blend that helps with alignment." "I know what she did, Rick. I have the records. I'm uploading them right now." Rick's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Truth is subjective, Sarah. But the law is very literal. And right now, the literal truth is that you've assaulted a security guard and stolen private medical records. That's not a good vibe for your future." He lunged. Sarah didn't think. She reacted with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. As Rick reached for the ledger, she grabbed the heavy desktop scanner, a bulky, metal-framed beast of a machine, and swung it with both hands. The corner of the scanner caught Rick in the temple. There was a sickening crack, and Rick crumpled into the stacks, his head hitting a shelf of biographies with a dull thud. He didn't move. The sugar packet fell from his hand, spilling white crystals across the sterile carpet. Sarah turned back to the computer, her breath coming in jagged gasps. She hit upload. 0%, 5%, 12%. The screen flickered. A notification popped up in the corner. System override. Emergency protocol initiated. Suddenly, the library plunged into total, suffocating darkness. The hum of the computers died. The flickering light went silent. The only sound was the distant, mournful wail of a siren approaching from the north. Sarah sat in the dark, her hands hovering over a dead keyboard. She felt a cold prickle of realization. Chloe didn't just have her house. She had the city. She had the power. She saw a faint glow from a laptop a few rows over. Someone had left it on. She scrambled toward it, her heart racing. The screen was displaying a public records portal. A new filing appeared, time-stamped 3 minutes ago. Emergency petition for involuntary commitment, Sarah Johnson. Diagnosis: acute paranoid schizophrenia with violent tendencies. Evidence: years of documented wellness checks and self-reported debt logs. Asterisk: subverted. Sarah stared at the screen, the blue light casting long, skeletal shadows across her face. She had thought the wellness checks Rick and Chloe had insisted on for years were acts of love. She thought the supplements they gave her were for her anxiety. She looked at the attached documents. There were hundreds of pages of logs. Every time she had cried, every time she had apologized for a mistake she hadn't made, every time she had expressed fear. Chloe had been building a medical file on her for half a decade. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights beginning to pulse against the library's glass walls. Sarah realized with a crushing weight that she had been waiting for the police to arrive. She had been counting on the law to save her. But the police weren't coming to listen to her story. They were coming because a concerned best friend had reported a dangerous lunatic who had finally snapped. The ledger in her hand wasn't evidence of a crime. In the eyes of the officers outside, it was the stolen property of a victimized woman currently in the hospital. Her attempt to use the truth had been the final piece of Chloe's trap. By fighting back, by running, by stealing the ledger, Sarah had fulfilled every requirement of the diagnosis Chloe had written for her. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the library's carpet. "Sarah Johnson, this is Officer Harris. We're here to help you, Sarah. Just put the book down and come out with your hands up." Sarah looked at the dark exit and then at the server room door in the basement. She didn't have a friend. She didn't have a reputation. She didn't even have her own sanity in the eyes of the world. She stood up, her jaw tightening. She wasn't going to apologize anymore. She retreated into the server room, the smell of ozone and hot metal filling the air. She didn't need the internet. She needed the local network. Using her drafting skills, she bypassed the library's firewalls. Not with code, but by physically rerouting the cables to the external display system. She didn't just send the files to a server. She sent them to the massive digital billboards in the shopping district outside. As the police burst through the server room door, the night sky over North Raleigh lit up. Chloe's satisfaction ratings, the ledger pages detailing her manipulation of local officials and her theft of Sarah's life, were broadcast in 40-foot-high neon letters for the whole city to see. In the chaos, Sarah slipped into a janitor's closet, donning a heavy gray coat and a moth-eaten cap. She walked past the officers, her head down, her heart a steady, quiet beat. They were too busy looking at the screens, too busy listening to the radio reports of the public data breach. 2 days later, Sarah sat in a hospital room, not as a patient, but as a witness. Chloe lay in the bed, her face pale, her expensive silk scarf replaced by a plastic neck brace. She looked small. She looked human. "The money is gone, Chloe," Sarah said, her voice a flat, calm line. "I didn't take it back. I sent it to the Jennifer Lewis shelter, all 400,000. It's untraceable now." Chloe turned her head, her unblinking stare fixed on Sarah. "You think you won? You're still the girl who counts her apologies, Sarah. You're still the ghost I made you." Sarah leaned in, the smell of industrial bleach stinging her eyes. "I found out what was in those herbal supplements, Chloe. The hallucinogens. the ones that made me think the world was tilting. I haven't taken one in 48 hours. The world is perfectly still now. Sarah walked out of the hospital and didn't look back. A month later, she sat in a small, empty apartment in Seattle. The rain here was different, constant, gray, and honest. She watched the fog roll in over the coast, a low, mournful foghorn sounding in the distance. She had her freedom. She had her name back. But as she sat in a coffee shop, watching a stranger approach her with a warm, friendly smile and an offered napkin, Sarah felt her hand twitch toward her hem. She didn't see a kindness. She saw a blueprint. She saw the lines of a ledger yet to be written. She looked at the stranger, her eyes cold and hypervigilant. She didn't smile back. She just waited for the deconstruction to begin.